We've covered time and materials as well as the cost plus workflow. Fixed price billing options tend to be a little bit different. We'll discuss lump sum plus direct costs. We'll also discuss milestone and schedule, which is scheduled billings, billing by percent, and construction billing. There's 4 options we usually have related to fixed price. One would just be a manual entry directly onto the invoice. So if we go back to the invoice and adjustment screen we've been looking at before, if I had, let's say I had a lump sum billing related to the project we've been discussing, I could come in here and I could enter a line directly onto the invoice. It will give me an error message that unposted. Let me go to this other one here instead. I can type a line directly on the invoice, so if I want to invoice them $50,000, I just type that on to that line. And I could call it progress billings or whatever type of posting I want to generate from this. I can call progress billings, and then I can generate this line, and it would just have a one-line invoice that it creates. I wouldn't have to rely on items that come from Allocator then. We can also do a scheduled billings, and a scheduled billings most often is date-driven. If you have contracts that you have a certain deadline, and on that deadline, you meet that deadline, you'll generate an invoice for the work done up until that point, and then you have a secondary deadline. So we could have quarterly deadlines, monthly deadlines, or even it doesn't have to be a regular deadline as well. So we can base all those billings off of a certain date. We also may have just the need to bill it based off how far along we are in the contract. So we would use based on percent complete, and then AIA billing related to construction invoices. Under the scenario of a lump sum plus direct costs, so we could enter our manual line like I just showed you on the invoice and adjustment maintenance screen, but we could also bring over line items for direct costs that might be billable, such as travel. That's quite common. We would have a lump sum plus travel. So we run billing transaction load. We could manually add our fixed price line like I just showed you, and the cost that came over from Allocator would also be included on that invoice. And then we'd follow the same invoicing steps that we did before, run the invoice, print it, and post it. And then we're finished. Also, we can do a scheduled billings. I'm going to show you a screen for scheduled billings first, and we'll talk through how that screen looks. As a reminder, this would be the one where you'd have milestone or date-driven billing, so we could have certain dates that we want to follow the billing for. Also, we can have a revenue schedule around that billing as well. So if you think about it, our revenue recognition may not match when we invoice it. So we would have the ability to set up 2 different schedules if desired, where we can identify the revenue schedule as well as the billing schedule. Let's look at one of the invoices we have. So I go to project, and I'm going to pull up one of my jobs I already have in place, and I have a revenue schedule. This happens to have both, so I have both a billing and a revenue schedule. I could choose just to have a billing schedule if I want to. I also can choose what account that it's going to be generating the revenue schedule for, and I have to put in the amount of the schedule. Now if I come over to the schedule, I can see that I have multiple lines created for this revenue schedule, and they're based on it. This happens to be a monthly schedule, so I create one for each month, but I could have these on specific dates that don't have any correspondence to each other. And then here I'm just going to bill $10,000 over every month for the next 6 months. Then I have a revenue schedule, but my revenue schedule is different than my billing schedule, and I want to recognize revenue at 2 points in time. I want to recognize 20% month 1, and then 80% month 6. You'll notice then that I have this billing schedule, and actually one of these has been processed. So I ran my scheduled billings and release, and I'll show you how to do that, and this generated an invoice line item. So the scheduled billings and release process is to come here, And you can filter this and run it by specific periods. I want to run it, this is the period it will generate the record for. The cutoff date is the record, I'm going to do 1/10. The cutoff date drives when it compares this date to the date on the revenue schedule. So if I come over here, it's going to compare that to these dates, and if the date falls before it, it will generate a revenue schedule for it. I can also indicate a specific project. I want to create one for, we'll run it for this one, and we'll see if I get something here. If I run it, I just hit begin processing, and it says that it created a draft for me for this project. And if I go look at that project, EN 123003, if I pull up here, my released went to yes. So the ones that haven't been released will always say no, and the ones that have been released will say yes. And it also created an invoice for me. So if I I'm going to show you a different one that I created earlier for billing project EN 123. This was created by the revenue schedule. And we can choose if we want to generate a schedule or not at the time it's released. So this is part of the schedule, billings, and revenue entry. If I pull up this job again, and I pull up that schedule, you'll see that I have auto-create the draft. And so that as soon as this is released, I'm going to have a draft and a completed status. And that's what I have over here on my invoice and adjustment. I have my, oops, wrong one. I have my draft and a completed status for 10,000. And now I can either add lines to it or just push it on through. So now I could print it final if I wanted to without even touching this. And but if I had edits I needed to make, we'd do the same process we did before. I'd set it back to in process, and we'd make the edits and move on. If you do a revenue schedule, it will generate it to the a journal entry to the GL, to depending on how you have your revenue set up on project controller setup. It could go to unbilled AR, unbilled revenue accordingly. I want to walk through briefly just how to create a schedule. So we'll, I already have schedule number 1 in here. I'm going to create schedule number 2. And the idea behind this is we just want to, I'm going to do test. So you can see here we can do billings or revenue or both. I'm going to do just billings, and I'm going to have it go to progress billings. And then I'm going to enter one for 40,000, and I'm going to have 4 units. So 1 unit of actually 2. So I'm going to do 4 units. So each one's going to be 10,000. Now if I come over here, I can enter the first line to the project and tasks that I want, and I'm going to choose this task, progress billings, and I'm going to put the date of period 1. And I'm going to put it 10,000 here. Now I can create additional ones automatically by hitting the duplicate and create. And I can choose what's my frequency. So on this one I'm going to do quarterly. And I'm going to create 3 more records. And I'm going to have the starting number. Actually, I'm going to just create 2 more. Starting number is 1, which is fine, and increment by 5. And I'll show you what this means. And I'll hit duplicate. So I started with 1 line, and I had line number 0, and then I told it to create 2 more, starting with line number 1 and increasing it by 5. If we increase it, leave space in the middle, we can come and add more later if we want to. You'll see that it created it quarterly, so month 1 and month 4 and month 7. And then it created them identical to the ones that I have here, but I could come in here and I could say, well, I want this one to be 15,000 and this one to be 15,000 as well. So now I equal my 40,000, and I need 1 unit and 1.5, 1.5. Okay? These have to, the sum of these must equal the sum of what's over here. So the amount of 4,000 has to equal the amount here, and the units of 4 must equal the units here. If they do not equal, you'll get an error message on save. I can link it to tax IDs as well, so if I want sales tax, I can include that. Also here I can do revenue schedule under the same concept. So I can duplicate lines here as well. And now I'm all set that I can run the scheduled billing. So conceptually what your user would do each month is they would come in here and they'd have a cutoff date and they just run it for that cutoff date, and all these schedules would be already in place, and you would begin processing and it would generate all these drafts for you to generate the invoices. And once the drafts are created, we do the same process we've done before. We do print the invoice final and post it. So we use the scheduled billings and revenue entry screen to create the schedule. Then we use our scheduled billings and release, and then we follow the same workflow that we use for all the other screens. And this is just a screenshot of a sample of the schedule, as well as the billing schedule breakdown, and then the revenue schedule, and then the billings release. The next one is billing by percent. If you have a fixed price contract and you're doing revenue recognition, so quite frequently the workflow that we'd be doing on a regular basis with we would be running revenue recognition for these fixed price jobs every month, and based on the percentage complete to the budget, which we covered in an earlier lesson, will generate your journal entry. But now we want to invoice this project, and so generally the revenue recognition does not always match the invoicing model, and maybe we can't invoice till we're 40% complete, but earlier months we hit 10%, 12%, 30%. We want to make sure we see that revenue recognition on the GL side, but we can't invoice till we get to 40%. So the project manager says we're at 40%, we're allowed to bill it. So now this is how we would go through that process. So now we use billing entry by percent as our screen, and the key to be able to do billing entry by percent is having your budget set up. So where does this budget come from? So it's set up in budget maintenance that we talked about earlier. We have to have a contract value budget set up in order for it to be able to identify what percent it's complete. I want to choose a different task here. So you can see the revenue budget, $7,500. That was how much I've budgeted for this task. And I have prior billings of $39.82. And then there's also a billing in process. Let's say this is now 100% complete, or I could do 90% complete. When it's 90% complete, it will look to see, okay, 90% of the $7,500 is $6,750. Here's my prior billings, and then my billings that it knows it has in process. So now this is my current amount. So it always has the ability to adjust to what it knows it has done before and what is currently in place compared to what you've told it as the final percent complete. And then it will create a net adjustment. So if you're overbilled and the percent complete is not, you've overbilled it, then it should create a negative percent complete to create a credit memo invoice if needed. The account category will be used to generate the line items. And so we just click on Add Billing. I gotta have a actual, we're gonna put this to materials. Usually we'd put it to progress billings, but we'll let it go here. Now it should generate my invoice for me. And if I go back again, we talked about this invoice and adjustment screen becomes the primary screen for all invoicing. So I can come over here and it should generate a line for the difference for my I have so many lines in here, but it will generate the lines for the difference. Here's the materials line here, 884.49. That was the line it created as the progress billings for the difference that I told it to bill for. So then we followed the same exact workflow that we are familiar with. So we can run revenue recognition in Project Controller. I mentioned that you can actually take the revenue, if you're going to bill your invoice exactly the way that you're recognizing revenue on the Project Controller side, you can actually run revenue recognition there and just pull it over to invoicing through billing transaction load, or we use the billing entry by percent if it's completely different on the timing of what we invoice. So we use billing transaction load to generate our lines. Then we follow the same exact steps that we followed for all the other ones. We print the invoice and we post it. Construction billing. We have instances where we have contracts where we have a scheduled value and we want to track work in process, stored materials, things like that, retention on that schedule of values. And so we could do it in some of the screens that we already have looked at, but it's not going to be really clean. So instead, we have a really nice construction billing screen that mirrors exactly the kind of tracking we need to do for AIA invoicing. So let's look at this screen and how it works. So construction billing entry, and I choose my project. And we'll see the first application here. I have some things that the company, I'm going to hide that column for right now. We have description of work. We can link it to a change order. One of the things that we didn't really discuss is we have the contract management module where you can do project budgets, a contract budget. Then you can do a change order on that contract. And if you do a change order, we can actually then do a project budget revision for that change order. And then that budget revision can be linked to a construction billing record. Actually, it's the project change order can be linked to a construction billing line item. So if we were using contract management, we could have our change order in place and then link it to a specific line on the construction invoice, and we would see that referenced here. So here's our schedule of values, very familiar if you're in this type of industry. And we have our projects, our tasks, and then most often the account category will just be progress billing because we want it to post to the same revenue account. We can have tax if we need to, but here's our scheduled value. We can also see what's been previously billed. Now this happens to be the first application. So application number 1, we won't have anything previously billed. And then we can identify, well, what percent complete are any of these line items? And then that will generate a work in place number. And we also can have stored materials, which we can also bill as well. And then if retention applies, we can apply a retention rate. And so you'll see for these lines, we are retaining 20%. And 20% was retained. And then we have a final billing amount for each line. You'll see the amount due then is 103,074.08. Now, when I've printed this final, it will generate my second application for me automatically. So now you can see here, my previously billed on these first 2 lines is populated. And now I can pick it up from here, and I can add more percent complete. So if this is now 70%, and maybe this one down here is now 30%, so then we get these additional billings that are going to be billed at this time for $420,922.04. If I wanted to process that, I can go into the next step is to then go in and do a construction billing print. Make sure my printer is okay, so construction billing print. And I'm going to, in order to be able to print it though, in final, I have to change this from in process to completed. So approved for print. And so now this becomes one that I can process. So GC123001. I'm going to print and final. I could print and preliminary if desired. And I have two of them out here, but I'm going to use this one. And I'm going to go ahead and print report. Actually, I'm going to do a preliminary first so we can see. So as you can see, this resembles very closely the AIA reporting format that is required. I can make it a little bit bigger here. So all my scheduled values is listed down the side. I can see all the amounts here, and then I can see what my previous application is, my work in place for this one, and then what my overall percentage as well as my retention. So this is the first page of the AIA invoice, and this can be modified if you have some tweaks to it. We have done that before. And then we also get our second page, which is related to just a summary of that data. So very nice and easy to use, and we can track our schedule of values without any problem. Then when those invoices are printed final, so if I print it final, again, it's going to feed to this invoice and adjustment screen where I can modify it. In the instance of these, we really wouldn't want to modify it. Everything related to a change on this needs to happen through the construction billing screen. So when we look at this invoice, there's going to be a couple things that we'll look for. We'll see that this invoice came directly from the construction billings. It's going to be in a completed status. Typically, we don't print these for purposes of sending them to the client because the AIA invoice functions as that invoice. However, if you needed a summary invoice that was more generic and gave just like the regular invoice formats we've been looking at, you could certainly still print that as well and send that to the customer too. So if you see these amounts here, these amounts came from, get back there. We see that these amounts came from the scheduled values, the amount, and then it's going to go to progress billings because that was the account category that we gave it. And it's straightforward. Then at this point, we just run the posting process just like everything else. So let's walk through the steps. We update the current application in construction billing. We then print the AIA invoice in final, and then we follow the same workflow as we did before. We print it and we post it in Project Controller in the flexible billings area. Let's review the things we learned in this module. We learned about the general flexible billings workflow. We talked about all those pieces related to that workflow, which is transaction load, auto invoice creation, making changes in invoice and adjustment maintenance, also invoice review and approval where we can approve the invoice before it's posted. That step is optional. Then we can print the invoice as well. We can post it, and then we can do reversal and duplication for items that were created incorrectly and need corrected. We also talked about billing setup and various options for fixed price invoices. This concludes the project accounting class. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully some of the things we talked about will help you get a better idea of what you can do with the product and improve if the product, how you're using it currently.